Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you P2P for inviting me. I am going to be talking about green infrastructure and more about how we can think about the 21st century of how we might plan and design our future cities. So just to get a little bit of an idea of who you guys are, at least in the sitting audience, you want to raise your hand if you're a student? All right. That's about 90%. And then if you're a designer, that's 0. Planner, faculty. All right, I think that, and then what did I miss? Retired community folks. Awesome. Okay, well, just like everything, just like green infrastructure, it takes a whole diverse group of people. And so that's what I want to kind of hint on when we go through some of the design strategies of green infrastructure. But it really takes a collaborative effort of not just the planners and designers, but it's the community members, it's the researchers at UH, and it's a multidisciplinary field. I like to usually kind of start off just because since I'm talking to 90% students about how I even got here. So my study was really in the water resources. I started at the University of Colorado Boulder and literally got a degree in water. It was very innovative at the time. And we did basically everything in policy and hydrology, social justice issues. And it really pointed a lot to this, so to our footprint on this planet growing more and more intrusive and impacting not just the lives of each other, but then impacting negatively all the ecological systems that are around us. And so I got very depressed, but I was hoping that there would be a solution that I could kind of latch onto and move forward with in my career. And so in my final semester, I got that opportunity. I started learning about the concepts of bio and phytoremediation. I guess raise your hand if you've ever heard of those two concepts before. Okay, we got about half of the room. So basically, bio means life and phyto means plant, and remediation stems from the word remedy, or which is basically, you take a remedy to heal yourself, right? So it's life and plants remedying, in the sense, the planet. And so I learned about, at Boulder, our next door neighbor was Rocky Flats, and Rocky Flats at the time was producing radioactive rods for a variety of weapons and nuclear power facilities. And so throughout that time period, they had actually had a really high uranium levels that was radioactive in some of this area. And I had basically I started reading papers about these researchers who are out there planting sunflowers, and that these plants were doing phytoremediation. They were actually breaking down the higher state of uranium and making that radioactive material benign. And I was like, wow, how is that? That's amazing. I really got interested on how ecological systems were out there and could be intentionally placed into situations that to heal a lot of the issues that we as mankind have created. And so then this led me to this man, a man named Dr. John Todd. And Dr. John Todd was based actually out of the Northeast in Vermont. And he was definitely an ecopreneur. He had a bunch of different patents on a variety of ecological technologies. And one of his most famous ones was this down here, what was called the living machine. And this was taking those concepts of bio and phytoremediation and putting them in an aquatic format of really wetlands in a box, more or less. And it's able to treat a whole variety of polluted water. This is actually the wastewater treatment plant facility in Burlington, Vermont, for example. So instead of it being this stinky, odorous place where you may not ever want to visit, this was actually a place where people would come and have lunch. They'd pick flowers, take them to farmers market. And it was really a paradigm shift for me. And I had the opportunity to basically serve as his apprentice for about 6 months. And then onwards, I worked for him and got shipped to Hawaii to deliver the technology to the state in 2000 under our late Senator Noy. He earmarked a project where, with at the time, it was through the biotechnology program at Pictor, to basically bring the technology to the state and see if this technology could work in Hawaii, utilizing Hawaii's native plants, Polynesian introductory plants, and tropical plants. And so we ran a research facility. Actually, it was in a really glamorous spot. It was at a slaughterhouse out in Ewa Beach. So you can imagine there was basically a big unlined pond where a lot of this polluted water with a lot of nutrients is going into the groundwater, so it wasn't obviously a good thing. So we were pulling water from there and then running it through a series of these, through the living machine, through these ecological tanks, and basically got to the water quality level that today meets the equivalent of our R1 water. Does everyone know? Does everyone know about recycled water? If not, it's okay. We're going to touch on it briefly. Gray water, yes, but recycled water is basically after you go through a treatment process, you either can hit several. The Department of Health categorizes it. R1 being sort of your highest quality water. R2 is still almost equivalent to R1. It's just doesn't have to meet the same water quality on the same regular basis as R1. And then R3 is your lower class of recycled water, but still very good for irrigation and other those types of uses without a lot of impact on public health. So anyway, so this project then spun off and led to many other projects in the state. I went back to school actually here. I got a degree in oceanography, which was a sidetrack sort of. But through oceanography, I really completed that whole water background that I had become so passionate about, where we learned a lot about climate change and also the role of how ecological systems work in our more brackish water systems. So in 2006, I formed my own company. I'll come back to that in 1 second. And so when I mentioned at the beginning that green infrastructure is an integrated process, within our office, we have urban planners, we have architects, and then of course my partners, John, I still work with, and his son, but as well as engineers, obviously for getting these kinds of systems on the ground. But also importantly, folks that do sustainability planning and economic analysis, so that we can really have a diverse spectrum of really creating, be able to best suit our clients' needs with any given type of project. And so I do want to go back to this slide, because after I came to Hawaii, I realized too that those concepts of bio and phytoremediation and ecological design really also have been here for thousands of years, and really have been around the globe for thousands of years with traditional indigenous practices. And so this has also become a huge inspiration and definitely integrated in our work of trying to pull from the past and try to understand our sites of how they were once used, and then how we can bridge that knowledge into the future about how we plan for our water resources in these areas. So, to kind of now start on the topic of thinking about the future and thinking about our water strategies, we cannot not think about climate change, right? In the news today, we obviously have heard more and more about these hurricanes and growing storms. But then the other flip side of it, we're also dealing with more increasing issues of drought, not just here in Hawaii, but globally. And so with the storms, obviously, we remember Irma. That's for still, folks in the East Coast are still dealing with it. It was being claimed as the strongest hurricane ever. And so with climate change, obviously with the warming of the oceans, this is how these storms can get larger than usual. And of course, I don't have a slide in, but of course, Maria just hit last night.
9.5 millibars this morning.
What's that?
9.15 millibars, the lowest millibars recorded ever this morning with Maria.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So we're obviously not living in a world where these things are becoming more regular. They're becoming larger. And then let's not forget Harvey. So I just I did pull up some statistics from Harvey, and because Harvey's actually a really interesting case, because again, these are types of cities that were not, this is an unusual event of a hurricane or a large storm coming in. Granted, they are becoming bigger and a little bit more ferocious, but the question then becomes, was Houston prepared? Did Houston think about its development over the last 20 years after knowing that they're going to get hurricanes, to be really prepared for when Harvey came? So we're going to run through it really quick, but just some few statistics. I mean, 51 inches falling, that's 11 trillion gallons of water hitting the city. You can see all of the 56,000 911 calls, down here, about 450,000 residents will be asking FEMA for assistance. So one of the main issues here was that FEMA had drawn the lines for folks to have flood insurance, many of the folks were actually they're outside of the FEMA flood insurance lines, meaning like they didn't have any flood insurance. This is definitely a huge deal because, you know, FEMA on average doesn't give any more than about $5,000 to $30,000 per resident. So this is, in my opinion, something that the city should have maybe thought about before these kinds of storms hit. Because think about, this is a picture, for example, of what the Houston area looked like in 1986. The gray areas and the purple areas are areas of impervious surfaces and roads. Granted, there was all these other green areas in the city. I read that they had removed about 70% of their wetlands over the course of through the 90s through the early 2000s. Raise your hand if you think that removing wetlands is a good idea. All right, so just for everyone online, no one thinks that's a good idea. So they, after the, you know, there's, raise your hand if you know about the Clean Water Act and the Wetlands Act, for example. Well, technically it's also illegal to remove wetlands. So through the Clean Water Act and the Wetlands Act that came out of the 1970s, people really understood that wetlands were really important as an ecological service. They can store water, they can't prevent flooding, but they can hold more water than concrete can, right? So then we move to the year, the year got cut off. Oh, it's 2017, sorry. And you can see the big difference of impervious surfaces. So, you know, 70% of the wetlands, they went out and sprawled the area. And then of course, you know, I mean, this should just be obvious, but impervious surfaces plus, you know, the high groundwater and the storms is going to equal flooding. I mean, has anyone ever seen, besides putting in pavers, has anyone seen concrete go through your driveway or sidewalk? No, it runs off, it runs down the road, right? So although you cannot say that keeping all those green spaces, you know, wouldn't have caused an issue, but it certainly would have reduced the amount of flooding damage that was caused. So in my opinion, I would think that Houston, no, they weren't ready and they weren't planning for these kinds of storms. And in many ways, can the city even be held negligible is a big question. But these are the kinds of issues that I think we as Hawaii need to think about when we start planning and developing our cities, because the reality is there's more people and there's going to be more development, but how can we be smarter about it? So this is just an example to just kind of show that Hawaii is still, you know, we have the potential of getting one of these storms one day soon. Fortunately, we haven't had really a really bad one since Iniki, and that was in 1992. But you can see the track record of the different types of tropical storms and depressions and hurricanes that we've had. And we've been generally pretty lucky. Mostly we're thankful to the Big Island that tends to divert it away from us. But at the end of the day, it's not a if question, it is a when question, right? And, you know, it wasn't that long ago that Darby hit, right? So this is just an image of, you know, what comes down the valley after some of these major storm events. So we look at the city and we have a lot of, you know, the flooding in the streets. Here, this was an image of Waimea Bay afterwards. Obviously a huge amount of sediment coming down, and this also has water quality issues, of course, for our coral reefs and so forth. But beyond just the, you know, the big storms, you know, in terms of the hurricanes and tropical depressions and so forth, just our regular rain events are changing. This is actually a paper that was co-authored by my old office mate, Marcy Grabowski, over here when I was over at SOAS. But basically this study found that the 20-year storm is actually becoming more frequent in an area. This is over in Kona. But generally speaking, we're starting to see these heavier downpours, all of our rain maybe in 1 month coming down in a couple events, you know, instead of being that light trade wind pattern. So this is important too when we think about our planning and design. Another big issue that we have to consider is sea level rise. Sea level rise is happening. This image was actually given to me by Chip Fletcher, but this is an image of the Aloi just during a very high tide event, or a king tide. And you can see that the Aloi is actually coming up through the storm drain. If you don't know, a storm drain usually moves water off the street into the canal. So if there was, you know, if we had a king tide and then a heavy downpour, what do you think might happen here, right? So so just things to consider, because this issue is certainly not going away. And then just on the total flip side of having too much water, we also have to deal with the issue of not having enough. So drought, unfortunately, is trending in Hawaii over the last 30 years or so. We've had a downward trend of rain, about 18% according to the UH scientists. And if you look at different projection models produced by SOAS, they actually can show that we might have as much as 50% total rain reduction in some of our leeward areas in the state over the next 50 years. And on the flip side of that, with less water coming in and getting into our aquifers, we also have to think about the growing population that's also happening. So right now, the way that the spread of the water usage is in the state, this was done with the state of Hawaii, Hawaii Conservation Plan in 2013. But basically it shows, you know, about 60% of our total water is going to agriculture. And then basically the other majority is going for water usage in our cities. And it's also important to note that, you know, we could be looking at doubling the state's population over the next, you know, 60 to 100 years. So we really need to think about what our water demands are, where's the water going in these sectors, to really, when we want to begin thinking about, you know, strategic water planning in the future. Because this is the reality as it is right now. This is from, you know, the State of Hawaii Commission of Water Resource Management. This is basically showing the different areas where we have groundwater supplies in the state. Not surprisingly, areas where we have high population here in the red, you're seeing that we're basically pumping out the amount of water that is basically at the same volume that's going in. So that's called a sustainable yield. So we're right at the sustainable yield, which is not necessarily where you want to be. You want to be, you know, more in the green, where you have more of a supply, where you're pumping out less than what's actually going in. Does that all make sense, right? So obviously areas where we have higher population or drier areas in the state with population and high water use, we're tending to pump out more than what's going in. So one of the biggest myths, and one of the things that I feel I hear all the time, why do we have to deal with water? We've got plenty of water in Hawaii. Is the reality is if you start looking at these trends and you're looking at usage, yes, that might be true in some areas, you know, like Hawaii, for example, but we cannot keep that mindset and continue to operate that of how we've been operating over the last 100 years. Because this is what our infrastructure looks like. So when we top it all off, you know, we've always looked at water as a liability rather than a resource. With our streams, we've hardened them so folks can put their houses right up against streams that would naturally want to flood. And, you know, we lose trillions of gallons of water in any rain event just going straight into the ocean instead of getting back into the ground, because we're just flushing it essentially down these channelized streams. On the other flip side of things, our wastewater treatment plants, we're basically, every time we pump that water out of the ground, we use it once, when we flush it down the toilet, it literally goes out into the ocean. We're dumping hundreds of millions of gallons of water a day as well. And then of course it's antiquated in terms of we've got, you know, holes in pipes, and when it rains, the water gets into the pipes and then we get spills. So the point is we really have, just not indifferent to anywhere else really in the nation right now, but our infrastructure is very old. And I put these pictures down here just to give you some perspective of the mentality that was used to create them, of the age. Does anyone know what this is right here? Computer. That's right. This is the first computer. It's called the Harvard Mark. This computer actually is not nearly as powerful as your iPhone, by the way. But you can see how far we've advanced in our computer technologies, right? But yet somehow we have not done anything really with our water infrastructure systems. So not all is lost, but you can't solve problems using the same mindset used to create them. So all of those old engineering textbooks, they kind of need to be set aside and be opened up to some new ways of thinking. And fortunately, you know, it still has its place, but we need to start transitioning from, you know, from these infrastructure systems that are highly prone, located along the coast, you know, Sand Island, for example, wastewater treatment plant right on the coast, susceptible to these storm events that I talked about earlier. We have board of water. We have one water supply. Should anything happen, we'd be stuck with no water. You know, to fill your bathtubs and get your, you know, sell out at Costco of all the water when a storm comes. But we really need to think we have all of our eggs really in only just a few baskets. And so really this is what I mean, that we in order to solve some of the problems of the future, we can't use the same mindset used to create them. Fortunately, we do have some solutions. I'm always a positive person. And so one of the really neat things that happened in 2015 was, and it actually got published in 2016, but there was a group that was convened by the Hawaii Community Foundation. It was called the Hawai'i Fresh Water Initiative. And basically they brought together a bunch of regulatory folks as well as large landowners and the boards of water and et cetera, and basically had a dialogue about how can we start setting goals for Hawaii's water future, because in the Aloha Plus Challenge original you know, document produced by Governor Abercrombie at the time, there was like two little sentences about water that was like jammed into the agricultural section. And really water is much bigger than that. We needed to create some serious goals because again, there's the myth in the community that we have plenty of water, but the folks in this committee knew that the realities of what was happening needed to be addressed. So
Lauren, before you leave the slide, it says here reduce use per capita by 25 gallons per day. What is the average gallons per day per capita
in Hawaii
right now?
Usually, well, the Department of Health gives it around 100 gallons per day per person. Yeah. So, which is on the high end of, and you know, and I don't know that they've updated that since people have gotten high efficiency low flow fixtures. Okay.
Is that like showering, or is that incorporating like how much water went into your hammer?
It doesn't have embedded water, but I like that you went there. No, this is, and if you talk about embedded water, man, we'd probably be talking about maybe 1,000 gallons a person per day. Does everyone know what embedded water means? It means that everything from making this computer to the lunch you ate to I don't know, to everything literally you see in this room and you're driving your car, it all requires some form of water to be able to produce and manufacture, for example, this computer, or that cow needed so much irrigation water for its grasses to be able to make per pound of burger. So it's a really interesting, I don't have time to talk about everything today, but it is actually a really interesting another way to view water and how water is really part of all of our lives. And if we really want to cut back on water, there's other ways you can do it through lessening consumption in certain things or not buying certain items. So we're going to dive into this real quick. So with conservation, well, this says 8%, but really it's going to be 25 gallons per day. The way that we really get to conservation, I think most people here understand this concept. You know, we can do things behaviorally, like, you know, not turning on the faucet while we brush our teeth, but there's actually a whole bunch of new types of fixtures. They're called high efficiency, low flow fixtures, where we can, you know, the old toilets were 5 to 7 gallons of flush. You know, the new toilets today are usually about 1.2, 1.3 gallons per flush. So these are huge ways we can start doing conservation. And then importantly with agriculture, because, you know, everyone wants to do agriculture on this on Oahu or in the state. And, you know, we have to really get smart about, if we want agriculture, how we're going to do it in a way that it can drastically reduce their water consumption. And that's a whole nother topic. But some of the new technologies coming out are in this field called precision agriculture. And they literally are equipment you can put in the ground. It looks at the chlorophyll and the soil and the plant health, and it'll just irrigate just enough based off of almost like a satellite imaging, as well as through these this is a company called Arable that, you know, creates these computer technologies to monitor plants. And interestingly, they're inexpensive. Like this one is about $1,000, and it can cover about 1,000 acres. So it's an inexpensive way for a farmer to kind of get on board. And then the other two, recharge and reuse. So here we have the goal of increasing about 30 million gallons a day of water, storm water getting into the ground, right, instead of running off. And this would happen in more critical areas, especially where we have groundwater supplies that we want to focus in. And then you have reuse, which is, that, again, that's the recycled water we talked about at the beginning. So this is doubling that amount of using wastewater treatment to produce recycled water to replace potable water needs, and doubling that volume by the year 2030. So we're just going to kind of dive into some of this and how it relates to green infrastructure, because green infrastructure plays a big role in how we're going to meet these goals. So, you know, green infrastructure really is this really broad topic. On the, I guess, the left-hand side, you have conservation, and obviously up the rainfalls, the forest. DLNR did a great pitch on that one. We know that if you have a native forest, it's going to bring in the clouds and hold the clouds and get that water into the ground. So we, you know, that's looking at these natural systems and the green infrastructure that's, you know, up in the forest is conservation. Where I want to focus is talk about green infrastructure and this regeneration back into the built environment. This is meant to be cheeky on the right-hand side. This is obviously filling in potholes with plants. This was actually done in Portland, Oregon, so not surprising, right? But really this concept of how we bring these ecological services and understand that we are part of nature. Nature is not just out there when you want to go for a hike, that we're actually part of it in the urban environment. And so, you know, in the built space, there's a whole variety of approaches how they can be brought in. You know, landscape features don't just have to be pretty things, they can be functional too. So this, for example, is a rainwater garden. Again, this is a project in Portland. You have on the far right-hand side, Windward Mall, that's actually what's called a bioretention. So it's taking all that, that stormwater from the parking lot and running it through that, sliver of terraced garden. Of course, you have green roofs. You know, even rainwater catchment is incorporating with green infrastructure, because really the whole concept is how do we mimic the natural cycles of water and nutrient management and put in those ecological services in our communities. So so just to kind of jump into a little bit deeper, recharge, I'm just going to throw out some things, make sure we're all on the same page here. What do you guys think stormwater, what is stormwater? How is it defined?
It's runoff after a rain event.
One step ahead.
Oh, sorry.
All right, so basically once that raindrop comes down and hits a surface like a roof or a parking lot, that becomes stormwater. So it's no longer rainwater, it's now stormwater. So then what is stormwater runoff?
Any of that water that runs off of an impervious surface.
Right, so at a certain point, it doesn't even have to be an impervious surface. I mean, you can still get stormwater runoff in a green space, but basically in those green spaces, there'll be a certain point of absorption of water to the point that it cannot hold any more water in the soil or in that planted area. And then that also can become runoff. So, I mean, why do we care? You know, well, let's think about what's in stormwater, right? So, you know, not only do we have, you know, this is actually 2006, so I don't really know the updated number, but, you know, if we talk about 95 streams being technically impaired in the state of Hawaii, that's a pretty big number, right? Every time that stormwater runoff or when stormwater gets generated and isn't recharged as quickly as possible, it's going to keep gathering with its friends, right? And you get all of a sudden get a lot of water coming down a street, and then it starts picking up all kinds of material, and then all that material that gets dumped into our streams typically first, and then ultimately into the ocean. So a lot of having a lot of impervious surfaces and not places for that stormwater to get, you know, slow down and get filtered and put into the ground can cause pollution, obviously. And you know, there's a whole variety of things of pollution that can come off of our residents. For example, we'll have, you know, fertilizers. We have lead-based paint still, you know, in a lot of our communities. Cars, of course, will then put heavy metals. Where do you guys think the heavy metals from the cars comes from?
Emissions.
There's emissions. I think I heard it. Tires. Tires actually have arsenic in them. And every time those little treads come off and you have to replace your tires, that's just a little bit of arsenic going down the drain. So we have all this stuff obviously being pushed down and into environments that maybe cannot tolerate that. And then of course we talked about the flooding issue as well as being a why we care issue. So when we think about how we're going to do green infrastructure and how we want to think about design, the number one thing we first got to understand is rainfall, right? We have to understand when you start looking into a site and start thinking about how are we going to try to slow down that water and try to recharge that water, we need to figure out, well, how much water are we talking about? And, you know, Hawaii is one of these special places where we have probably the most diverse amount of rain, you know, per square mile in the country. But there's a lot of great resources on trying to figure out how much rain you have in any given space. One of my favorites was actually made by the University of Hawaii Department of Geography. How many people know about the Rainfall Atlas? Okay, about half of you in this room. This is a very special tool. Nowhere else in the country do they have a tool like this where you can literally go on a map and click your spot and it'll take all the station information and pump out a mean average. So that's a really great tool to figure out how much rain you have in your area. Granted, this doesn't take into account what projected future rain might be. Another great tool is over here on the far right, which is at NOAA. And I know it's not probably too clear, but this actually provides a similar map, and its output will provide, you know, we talk about the 10-year storm or the 20-year storm or the 100-year storm, and it'll output what those volumes are. So once you kind of have a handle of how much rain and what storm event you want to go after, well, I guess I should back up. If you have the ability to actually get real data from a station, which is not usually the easiest thing to do, the other thing to do is you can do what's called precipitation frequency analysis. And I don't want to get too technical, but they did ask me to talk about design. But here you can basically map out the frequency of how often the different types of rains happen, right? And usually as designers, we try to target the amount of rains that happen, you know, 90 to 95% of the time. And the other rains that, you know, do happen, you know, we don't not acknowledge them, but when we talk about trying to manage water quality, we try to take all the storms that happen under that curve. And then usually as it continues to rain harder and harder and harder, the water gets cleaner. So it's that first flush effect of trying to get that debris and that sediment, you know, in your kind of treatment and recharge prior to getting offsite. So what's interesting when you think about these numbers, you know, again, because of the diversity of the rain in the state, what's interesting is these 85 and 95 percentile storms are kind of interesting to think about because it's a little bit counterintuitive. So let's look at Manoa, right? So Manoa's, the middle one is, the middle one, let's look at the middle one, 1.42 inches being the 95th percentile storm. Right? Manoa gets rain more frequently than a place like Waianae, right? But what's interesting, when it rains in Manoa, you get more of that light rain. So you're not getting typically heavy downpours. But if you look at a place like Waianae, 95% of the time, they're getting a heavier downpour. Like all that rain is coming in at once. So they actually have a higher 95th percentile rain event. Does that make sense? Yeah, so it's sort of a little counterintuitive. Just because a place gets more rain doesn't mean that their 90 and 95 percentile storms are going to be less. So it's actually almost the opposite. In our leeward sides, we see usually bigger downpours. So after you think about the rain, you also have to think about the soils. And so soils are also highly diversified around the state. Some places, obviously in Kona, you have lava, and that's going to percolate really quickly. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you might have clays where you may not be able to get any water into the ground. So you have to have these considerations if you're going to be even able to recharge water. Because if you can't recharge water, you might have to think of other strategies like storing water, for example, in tanks and releasing it slowly or reusing it. And then once you kind of get through that process and have a handle of what your site is like, then you can start thinking about what are the different types of green infrastructure practices that you may want to implement, within your community and project. So, some of these are kind of, out there with literally making green walls all over a building, but the ones that we commonly see more often are the things like permeable pavement. You also can have stormwater gardens, green roofs, but these are the kinds of green infrastructure systems that almost that you can use out of your toolbox, but how you select them is really going to be site dependent. And this is just a diagram showing, for example, how this looks like in a cross section. So let's say you have a parking lot. Instead of just having your curb that just separates the parking from the actual landscape, which I challenge you guys when you go out and go parking, see how often you see that curb that cuts off water from the parking lot. You'll see it 90% of the time. But instead, why don't we design parking lots where it have a curb cut? And then, in this situation, this is, bioretention or biofilter. So then that water goes into your intentional engineered landscape that can manage and store stormwater. The plants do that bio and phytoremediation. We talked about that earlier. They can literally uptake some of those heavy metals into their plant tissues. And then as that water on a lighter rain event, that water can recharge into the ground. During really big rain events, it can then, connect in. You can have under drains that can connect into the city storm drains. But at least when that water goes out, it's a lot cleaner than it was just otherwise being directed into the stream. So we're going to go through, I have just a few more slides, but I want to touch on, because green infrastructure also really touches in on wastewater treatment and reuse. And there's similar to that living machine technology I mentioned at the very beginning, the whole array of world of what's called constructed wetlands. There's a whole variety of ways that it can be applied, both for stormwater and for wastewater, but this kind of gives you a general idea schematically of just the different types of wetlands that are out there. And really the way that they work is really simple. I mean, I'm sure most folks have a little bit of food web knowledge, right? It starts with the microbes. The microbes are biofilms. They do a lot of digestion of sometimes the longer chain organic molecules. And then they, of course, need a place to attach. And so then the plant roots provide that habitat. The plant roots are similar in terms of having a lot of surface area, like our intestines. If you were to roll out all of our intestines, it'd be miles and miles of surface area. Sort of the same concept with the plant roots. And so then they produce all these other functions that support those biofilms and microbial growth. And then they take out maybe like 5% of the nutrients or pollutants, but it's really providing the condominium complex for these biofilm communities. And so that then depending on, what the waste strength is coming in, you just have a certain period of time that it needs to go, sit and have retention time through the treatment system. So just some examples of projects locally. The new UH campus out in West Hawaii, it's called Kapalama campus. It's a LEED Platinum facility. This is actually during construction, so I unfortunately don't have a picture yet of how it is today, but you can see, you don't see the water on the surface. This eventually will just look like a garden. It's treating the water to secondary standards, and all the water will then be recycled and used on campus for irrigation. Another one down the road was for Kaiser Permanente in Kona. Again, this is a wastewater treatment plant. I mean, you wouldn't normally think of it, but it's also growing heliconias and other things where the operator comes out and cuts the flowers and leaves them out for the hospital staff. So in just summary, I'm going to pull all these things together because this is really where I kind of want to touch on when we think about how we can bring all these little pieces together and start thinking about the future of our cities. And that's this idea of distributed infrastructure and water resiliency. So again, right now we have all of our eggs in just 1 or 2 baskets in terms of our water supply, which really doesn't give us much water security. And if we want to think about how the renewable energy industry has been operating over the last decade, they've been moving more and more to distributed systems, right? We have folks that can have their own solar panels, we have solar farms, and we really have less reliance in general on eco. So following that same model, there's new communities being built on the mainland that demonstrate this. One that was recently constructed in 2015 This is in San Francisco, right in the middle of the city. This is the Public Utilities Commission building. And so this building actually has about a 30,000 gallon cistern at the basement of its building, and that then gets used for water inside the building for washing hands, for example. And they actually have a little fountain in there to be cute, to show that this is produced from rainwater. And then what you're seeing here of the planted boxes, this is again constructed wetlands, wastewater treatment system that's serving as landscape along a city block. I mean, this to me is a real paradigm shift in terms of how they're demonstrating this in a way that can also be beautiful. And so the water goes through the constructed wetland. It goes through a final mechanical filtration and disinfection, and that gets used for flushing their toilets. So during the rainy season, this building is about 60% self-sufficient in terms of its water. Another one that was recently built, this is actually more of in a block format. That was a building format. This is about 3 different buildings, condominium buildings, not very similar to maybe our Kaka'ako, for example, residential, some mixed use. And here they also have an on-site wastewater treatment system using, again, a constructed wetland. They also have green roofs that serve as parks for the community. All their rainwater is done beautifully in their landscapes, as you can see on the far right, as water features, and really demonstrating that you can have, and again, I also want to mention that these both facilities are doing renewable energy, and they also are looking at bike systems. So it's a complete concept of how you can think about what you might need in a community and again spread out those baskets for the eggs in terms of building water resiliency and energy resiliency. So we're just starting to do this via a program called Greening America's Communities with the EPA. We're actually partnered with a firm out of San Francisco called Community Design Architects, and essentially we're looking at 4 TOD stations, trying to figure out if we can take these concepts into the lwilei and Kapalama area, and also putting some layers in there, trying to understand what the year 2100 is going to look like in these areas. So this is, for example, different data layers showing potential sea level rise and groundwater inundation in these areas. The red boxes are the 4 sites we're looking at. And we want to, some of the main goals is, to reduce flooding and building that water resiliency and infrastructure. Again, in an area that, we're also looking at, that's at its sustainable yield. So at the time, and this may change, but they were even considering up to 10,000 more units going up in this area. So that's why looking at this in this way is important to think about, because does it make sense? Where does it make sense? And how do we be smart and do appropriate development, right? So so we threw out the idea of the eco block and eco district concept to the city, and we actually got a lot of positive feedback. This is in the past, maybe some of the officials, may not have wanted to lose customers and so forth, but I think everyone's starting to understand and get on board that we need to have diversified water supplies, and the less pressure that we have on our existing infrastructure also means a little bit less pressure on the Board of Water as well as environmental services. So, we looked at a couple different ways of thinking about it. We wanted to create sort of a generic thought process of what these facilities would be like. So, thinking about, there was a lot of community feedback that they need, places, they like places for gardening, they want places to, enjoy space. So obviously these areas on the roof, can be those kind of places in high density environments. We also looked at, if they would have on-site wastewater treatment, if they're going to be in areas that might be susceptible to flooding, not only raising the elevation of all future buildings, just to know that sea level rise and storm surges are highly possible, but even thinking about putting those kind of more critical infrastructure items, such as, if you were going to store water on site, maybe those would be raised too. Like lessons learned from New York City after Sandy was that all those buildings, all their primary generators and electronics and everything was stored in the basements of the building, which shut everything down. So even if you're going to have renewables and your on-site systems, you might want to think about strategically putting them above on the second floor or higher rather than in basements. And so we did some just sort of early analysis, because then we always get the thing back, oh my gosh, it's going to cost too much, kind of a thing. So we did some early tallying of what a typical household kind of portfolio of water would look like. And then essentially thinking about what would be the main end uses we want to target for non-potable water use. So I'm throwing out non-potable, but does everyone know what that means? Everyone's shaking their head, yes. Okay, so because it doesn't have to just be recycled water, but it also can be that stormwater collected in a rain catchment tank. We also are talking about things like condensate recovery. You guys know how that might work? So air conditioning systems, they sweat. And if you have areas where it's really hot outside, you can actually get a lot of water inside some of these facilities. And so that's actually a real low hanging fruit, because you don't really need to treat it that much. It's pretty clean water. It's basically just condensate. Whereas, you know, the more you go towards wastewater, it's going to require more treatment and more cost. But anyway, so the main end uses that are easy enough to replace our potable water are typically things like irrigation, water features, fire suppression, and then also that makeup water that needs to go back in for cooling, for example. Oh, shoot. And toilet flushing, that should be purple too. So I just did some analysis thinking about different densities in these buildings. But at the end of the day, the main thing to think about, the middle, if we just wanted to match toilet demands, for example, if you look at this purple, the purple circles, it shows different volumes of wastewater generated under different types of density in buildings. So from the low end, you have the 6,000 gallons per day. That's like similar to the San Francisco PUC building I just mentioned, you know, all the way to a higher density facility that, you know, may require something like, up here, 1 million gallons. These are annual volumes, and then these are daily volumes required for the toilet. But I guess the main thing I want to show is the bottom number here is basically the amount of savings they would have annually by not using potable water and not flushing that, or not having all that water go to the toilet water, go to the sewer. Their annual savings could be anywhere as low as around, you know, 40,000 a year, all the way up to, you know, we have about 466,000 a year. So there really could be, depending on what the capital cost would be, there could be some return on investments for implementing these types of systems. And so I'm just going to kind of lead it with, you know, really where we need to go is we're moving forward with policies. But we also really, you guys are going to be all part of it. We really need leadership because the main thing is, you know, I think I heard on the radio before or yesterday, it was on a different topic, but I think it's kind of relevant. It was like, if we can't start planning for the hard things now, they're going to happen and then it'll be chaotic. And in many ways that resonate. I might not be exact with that quote, but if you think about it, if you can't start planning the hard things now, when it does happen, it'll be chaotic. And you think about what's happened with Houston, with Harvey, and with all these other storms that happen, or when we're caught off, you know, caught off our track, we will get it into the face, and it could be more costly. I mean, FEMA has said for every dollar spent for prevention, we'll save $4 in future damages. So I think if we really can start thinking about, you know, yes, it's going to be a little bit harder to do. If we can start enforcing that new development just has to move forward and go into the 21st century, updating our infrastructure. You know, we maybe could put some incentives in place for them, but maybe we also need to create ordinances. But these are the tough questions, and this is what's on the table right now. But this is the direction that we all need to kind of jump on board with. So I'm going to leave you with that, and I'm over time. So hopefully, if you have any questions, you can hang around. Thank you. Okay. Yeah.
That slide that you had of rainfall on Oahu, there was 3 columns. What was the title for each column? I saw like there was the township on the left. curious. I saw at the top it was like 24-hour and then 100.
Oh, this one?
Yeah, what are those columns representing?
Yeah, okay, so you have the, okay, maybe I should back up a second. Right, so like, and sorry for those people online, but whatever. So there's, if you go to like this kind of a website from NOAA, you'll see that basically there's durations of how long the rain lasts. And so, so then essentially you can have a 10-year 2-hour storm or a 10-year 24-hour storm. And those are gonna have different volumes associated with it, right? So typically when we talk about water quality volume, we're typically talking about a 24-hour duration. But the 2-hour storms are also important when we think about intensities, right? So like if all that rain is coming down in just a short period of time, that's also important to think about. So, so here we have basically, we have the 85th and 95th percentile 24-hour storms, so that's these two. And then we have a 100-year 2-hour storm. Yeah. So when we talk about, they call it low impact development, and the rules with the city, for example, require that you design your systems for a 1-inch 24-hour storm event. And the reason why I bring this slide up, and I probably should have mentioned that, because the reason why I bring that slide up is because it really changes a lot depending on where you're at, whether or not you're really going to hit the water quality volume in a 1-inch 24-hour storm. But they take kind of just the general national and I guess average for Hawaii, that would cover the 90 percentile storm event. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I wasn't clear.
This is a great segue into my question about reservoirs.
Mm-hmm.
Hawaii has a long history with reservoirs and aqueducts. Maybe a not so good history in the more recent past.
Right.
But it obviously plays into this idea of retention and recharge and sustainable yield. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on
that.
What's the future of knowing what we know about climate change. Should we be thinking about getting our reservoirs up and running again? I heard Nu'uanu is at like 5%.
Right. I mean, so it's a good question. Obviously, the larger the systems, the more liability they have. A lot of what I like to think about in green infrastructure is, again, distributed systems, and they're smaller distributed systems because it's a little bit less liability, a little bit more cost, but again, you don't run into some of the potential issues that might happen. But that being said, the Board of Water is planning on getting some of those going again. I'm not against it. I just think that there's going to be, it's part of that portfolio of how we're going to manage, right? It won't solve all of our problems, but it'll provide some storage supply. Yeah.
Bill just mentioned that part of the reason we kind of moved away from those is almost every reservoir is an earthen dam. Right. Which don't meet modern safety.
I was going to say the liability. Yeah. Right.
Nobody wants to own a dam anymore, for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
You know, I follow climate change closely, and we've all seen every time it rains heavy, it's all this precious water just flowing out into the ocean unnecessarily in some cases. So I think if we could just capture it somehow.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think again, what would be really strategic would be to map the island, not just Oahu, but have the different maps and start identifying the areas that we think would be strategic for recharge or future development, what would be strategic water supplies and drier areas versus wetter areas, and start thinking about planning that matches those sites and those goals. But if we're kind of just operating, okay, we have some goals, but go out and do them all wherever, it's not necessarily the most efficient way to think about it. And I remember when Bill was at the commission, we talked about, doing this sort of greater economic analysis of really, what is the true cost of water from getting it out of the ground, finding new supplies, connecting that to E&V of, once you flush your toilets, getting, the pumps, getting it to your wastewater treatment plant, and then the cost of maintaining those pipes, you know, by the time we get to Sand Island and the cost. So if we can start thinking about, okay, if we could save costs by, you know, thinking about it, I think we could have a lot more ROI basically if we looked at the whole system and then got smart about, you know, which systems would make the most sense in certain areas, and not abandoning our infrastructure as it is today, but, you know, I guess not depending on it as much as we always have been. Yeah.
Thank you.
Are you raising your hand? Yeah.
This is another question. I was going to ask you to expand on that point a little bit more. We did a real rough calculation of electrical costs alone. A pump is $1 million a day.
I'm sorry, could you speak up? Because not only can we not hear it in the room, but the folks on the microphone definitely can't
Oh,
hear.
sure. A couple years ago, there's a study that's now on the Water Commission website. We're doing a quick, dirty calculation of what it costs, electrical costs alone. To pump 1 million gallons a day for a year out of the groundwater, the central water, move it to a use, move it to a wastewater treatment plant, and then move it out in the ocean. About 150 million gallons a day on a walkable pump, and then 2/3 of that ends up in the ocean later. So 2/3 of the water we pump just gets thrown out in the ocean. The electrical cost to move the water is on the order of $440,000 per million gallons per year. So every 1 million gallons you didn't have to pump or use locally, potentially you could save up to $440,000 in electrical costs.
Wow.
So that you could start to use quantitative savings in terms of volume of water to generate electrical savings, because electrical costs are price elastic. Water is underpriced and it's not price elastic. But conservation of water could lead to savings on the energy side.
Yep.
So if you could capitalize that, let's say you save 10 million gallons a day that you use through conservation.
Yep.
You have to change the pricing a little bit. You could generate, in effect, $4.5 million a year, which could be used to pay off a bond, which could be used to help finance infrastructure.
Yeah, and so I'm going to add that to this in our final presentation to the city. So what Bill then is saying is, so if we end up saving, you know, something on the order of, I don't have these in annual, but let's say if it was you know, if it's 27,000 gallons a day, that's easily going to be, I don't know how many million a year, but then that could also get added into, you know, an indirect cost savings. Yeah.
One thing in convincing people about the cost is the cost of not doing something.
Right.
We tend to think it's zero. But in fact, the cost over time of not making the change aggregates.
Right.
And so when you actually present the alternative, you start to see, wow, the cost of not doing something is worse than making the changes.
Yeah, especially if you have to go back and retrofit later, which we all know isn't easy. So.
All right, thank you so
Yeah.
much. These are really important discussions, and I'm so glad for the expertise in the room. Great presentation. If you want to join us next week again, Dr. Rebecca Rials will be presenting on closing the loop, following up to some of the concepts that are being talked about here. So I hope you'll join us next week for that presentation as well. And then 2 weeks from now, an official green infrastructure presentation, although I think next week's falls into that category as well. So anyways, thank you so much for coming.